Hello, we come back at Genesis chapter 12, and here we have the call of Abraham, and here attention is given to one man, but indeed, as I have stated before, that when God called Abraham, he called a nation, and it is important that we don't individualize scripture. God specifically dealt with a nation in the Old Testament. So we begin here in the call of Abram, and here is after Terah. His father had died in Haran, and God comes at this juncture. And in verse 1 it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, Get thee out of thy country and of thy kindred and from thy father's house unto the land that I will show thee." And you see here, God calls him out. He said, "Come out of your country, and then from your kindred." And then he says, "Come out of your father's house." And he says, "To a place that I will show you." God never told him where he's going to take him, but he says, "Come out and I will show you the place." He never told him the place, but nothing Abraham had here except his faith. And there was no map, there was no compass, but here is that he is to walk by faith. And as noted in Hebrews 11:8, it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called out into a place which he should have received for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went." Again, not knowing whither he went. He was to walk by faith, and this is the calling of God. God never told us where we are going, but he wants us to trust him and keep walking, and he will let us know when we get there. But this is God's way. This has been God's method, and this has been his way in calling his people. And here he says in verse 2, and it says, "I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." And God's promise to Abraham here is, you told him to walk and leave everything, get out of your country, out of your kindred and your father's house, and walk. But at the same time, he gave him a promise that he will make him a great nation. Again, God called him to become a nation, and this nation is the nation of Israel, as you can see later on. And also, he said that he will bless Abram and make his name great. And also, he will be a blessing to the Gentiles, to the Gentile nation. And some of the promises, for instance, if you read in Genesis 17 verses 6, and say, God says, "And I will make thee exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee." It says, kings shall come out of you. That means you are to have fruitful, this is going to be a very great mighty nation. Kings shall come out of you. That this is a fruitful promise. Moreover, in Genesis 18:18, it says, "Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." You see, God's promise is that he will be a mighty nation, and the nation will be a blessing to all nations of the earth. And furthermore, this was the fulfillment of God's promise of a great nation in Moses' day, which is in Deuteronomy 26, verse 5, which says that, "And thou shalt speak and say before the Lord thy God, a Syrian ready to perish was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there with a few, and became a nation, great, mighty, and populous." And this was the fulfillment of God's promise that Abraham became a mighty nation, became populous nation, and here is God's calling on this man Abram here to make him out as a nation, and not just a nation, but also a great nation, a great one. And he says in verse 3, he says, "And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Likewise in Genesis 27, verses 29, it says, "Let the people serve thee, the nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren, and thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be everyone that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee." And this, in the future, this was the blessing on Jacob by Isaac. Isaac, this became a generational blessing also that is passed down from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here, the mother's son is a relative to other nations of the earth, that Israel is going to become the lead and the greater nations of all the earth, the greatest nation of all the earth here. And everything is going to derive from Israel. You see, also in Exodus 23, verse 22, he said, "But if thou shalt indeed obey his voice, and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy unto thy enemies, and an adversary unto thy adversaries." And the word "curse the nation that curseth thee," synonymously means that God will be against the nation in opposition to the nation of Israel. And those who hate Israel, those who hate Israel's nation, are the enemies of God. And this was, and then also lastly in Numbers 24, verse 9, this was Balaam's prophecy when he was hired to curse Israel. And here it says, rather than cursing him, he reversed it into a curse. Rather than cursing the Israelites, the curse was reversed, rather. And in Numbers 24, verse 9, it says, "He couched, he lay down as a lion, and as a great lion. Who shall stir him up? Blessed is he that blesseth thee, and cursed is he that curseth thee." And in the day of Moses, the king of Moab hired Balaam, his prophet, to curse Israel. And then God reversed the curse later on, and the Moabites became a cursed nation. So this was also a fulfillment here. Moving on in verse 4, it says, "So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran." See, Abram departed out of Haran, and God calls attention here twice that he took Lot with him and went out of the land. And from Haran, he went from Haran, now going towards the land of Canaan. And here Abraham was 75 years old as said at this time when God called him. And then in verse 5 it says, and Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan and into the land, and then they came. And into the land of Canaan they came. And so they left Haran here, and Abraham took his wife, he took his brother's son, Lot, and gathered all their substance. And then they left Canaan. But here it says they went with many souls. The word souls here means that Abraham, when he left Haran, he left with many people. It was a gathering. He left here. And then it says, and Abraham passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. You see here, Abraham's journey was from Haran. He started off from Haran, then went to Shechem, and from there he was heading towards Canaan. And he mentioned here that the Canaanites, the descendants of Ham, we know that the Noah had a son called Ham, and these are the Canaanites came from Ham. You remember when God cursed Canaan, and so Canaan then became a nation. Here's the nation of Canaan, called the Canaanites. And these are the first Aboriginal tribe here when Abraham got there. And there the Lord appeared to him. And in verse 7 it says, and the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. And there built he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. Now notice the character of God. As noted previously in Noah and the ark, you know, God validation always comes after we begin to walk by faith and we obey him in our faith walk. God told Abraham to, first of all, come out of your own people. And Abraham did not know where he was going. He just kept walking and took his wife, took his nephew, and as they were coming, it says that God appeared. God came to Abraham. It says God appeared unto Abraham and then validates him more. It says, unto your seed will I give this land. So this is the journey that Abraham had been walking. Did not know where he was going. He just heard God and then kept going. And now he comes to this land and God now confirms it. It says, unto your seed will I give this land. And the Bible says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. So we have to walk with faith. And here God reiterates his promise. And he said, I will give you this land. And again, the land he's telling him is the land of Canaan. Although the Canaanites were still in their land, and he took almost 400 years for the children of Israel to finally claim that land. But God is now telling him the promise. He says, this land is what I'm going to give you. And it says here that Abraham worshiped God and he builds an altar. He builds an altar to God and he solidifies his faith by building an altar to God. And verse 8 it says, and he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Har on the east. And there he built an altar unto the Lord. It says, and then he called upon the name of the Lord. And then Bethel here means the house of God. he built an altar, speaks about the devotional habit of Abraham, and it shows his dedication to God. And no wonder God calls him a friend. He calls Abraham a friend, or he's a friend of God. Because everywhere Abraham goes, he devotes himself. This altar symbolizes God, his constant aware of God and constant devotion in hearing God and walking by faith. And not a perfect, of course, not a perfect walk, but here he's just walking by faith and devotion to God. And in verse 9, it says, "And Abram journeyed, going on still towards south." So he's heading south now. He's going down to south, and he heads down south, coming from Haran, and here he goes to Bethel. He keeps on going south in his journey towards Canaan. Then in verse 10, it says, "There was a famine in the land, and there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt and sojourned there. For the famine was grievous in the land." And Abram, meets this famine. As he was going down south, and he meets this famine on the way toward Canaan. And he heads to Egypt. And from this perspective, we see that Abraham's first inclination is that, his inclination, once he meets this famine, was first to go down to Egypt. And that's what he does. And also if you look at it in Genesis 26, verse 1, later on, it says, and there was a famine in the land beside the first famine that was in the days of Abram. And Isaac went unto King Abimelech, king of Philistine, unto Gerar. And be aware, in Isaac's days, this was a normal habit, that whenever a famine comes, that to avoid a famine, people have to go down to Egypt to escape the famine. Because, and the normality is to head down to Egypt and to avoid this famine. And Egypt was like the first civilized system at that time. It was the first civilized place at the time of Abraham, is where people buy, sell. As today, we have in this country, we have, trades and all these things. And the system is what God is totally against, is buy and sell civilized system. And here we see the walk of an immature believer. And this is what we always do at that time when God called us. You hear Abraham is going against the grain, he's going against the things that God hates. He's going into this system which is called Egypt. And basically, it's like having one foot in God and another foot in the world. So this famine came, and he meets this famine, and immediately his first inclination is to go down to Egypt. And yeah, he have one foot in Canaan. He's marching in Canaan, and then he took one foot out. Now he's in Egypt. He's walking on both ways, and usually this causes a great blunder. And as we can see later on, where Abraham gets himself into a big trouble. But it says here in verse 11, it says, "And it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt." Now see, he come into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai his wife, "Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass that when the Egyptians shall see you, they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. And here he's covering up sin of what is happening here. That's what is happening here. And Abraham is attempting to cover up his fear. In this aspect, he is being fearful of his life because he has entered into this place, Egypt, this worldly system. And as he was marching towards Canaan, walking in God's purpose. And also mentioned later here as mentioned later in Genesis 20 verses 11, he says, and Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place. And it's not speaking about Egypt, but he was speaking about in another scenario. But again, he's saying, because the fear of God is not in this place, speaking in Canaan, that they will slay me for my wife's sake. So this has been, he has been fearful of his life throughout, even when he entered Canaan, and he didn't need to do all this. You know, if he would have obeyed God and continued on his journey to Canaan. But here, Abraham lying became habitual for him, the sin of lying, and in the family of Abraham. And later on, Isaac, his son, is going to follow his footsteps. But to sum this up, it's like Abraham was walking with God, and this famine came, and now he turned all the way to Egypt. And from Egypt, he began to try to cover up a lot of things. And that's what usually when we get to the worldly ways, we're trying to do everything to cover up and trying to hide and cover up our faces, cover up our tracks, lying to. And this is what always happens to the believer who is not careful about entering into the world. But here you see, moving on, it says in verse 13, it says, Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. It says, call me my sister. Say that you are my sister, and not my wife, because I fear death. I fear that they're going to take my life, and act as though you're my sister. In verse 14 it says, And it came to pass when Abram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair. The princess also of Pharaoh saw her, and commended her before Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Apparently, Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when they saw her, they recommended Pharaoh to this woman. And they says, okay. And Pharaoh says, okay, call her to me. And they brought her. And he says in verse 16, and he entreated Abram well for her sake. And he had sheep and ox and he asses and men servants and maid servants and sheep, asses and camels. You see all these goodies. We're going to talk about it later on because this is very important. Because all these things that the king of Egypt gave to Abram also included a package, and we're going to talk about this package later on. And it says, and Sarah here was taken into Pharaoh's place. You see, here this man saw saw Sarai, and he lusted after her. Back then, the kings would have killed the husband and take the wife, but because of her beauty, obviously. But Pharaoh, rather, he gave these riches to Abram and riches to take Sarah. But here Abraham is basically, you know, not willingly, but he's basically selling his wife. And this not only brings guilt to Abram, but also puts Sarai in danger. And also, it causes her to lose her dignity. But also, later on, Abimelech gave riches back to Abraham, but for the restoration of Sarai, which is in Genesis 20, verse 14. It says, and Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants and gave them unto Abraham and restored Sarah, his wife. Later on, his name is going to be changed to Abraham, and his wife is going to be changed to Sarah, from Sarai to Sarah, from Abram to Abraham. But this was to restore him, restore Sarah's dignity. But here, this man is selling his wife's dignity, and you know, this was not good. And when we consider that Abraham, being human, hence not infallible, you know, we have to consider that Abram was just another man that God has called, and he is full of insecurities. You know, God never called us to become perfect, but he's the one who's going to make us perfect. And we see here this is a blunder in Abraham's life, and God is going to make good here, and God is going to come to rescue him out of this situation, because only God could rescue him out of this situation. And in verse 17 it says, and the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai's, Abram's wife. See, God plagues Pharaoh, and God is now operating behind the scene, you know, protecting the sanctity of marriage of Abram and Sarai. You know, no man is to be with her, because her womb is separated by God. Because the fact that God says that she's barren means that God is separating her womb, because no man is to be with her except her husband, rightful husband. And God operates behind the scene more than anything else. And Abraham couldn't do anything to save his wife, obviously, as you see, but God will save them. And God saved them by causing him, you know, by causing a plague, bringing a plague to this man's life. Then in verse 18 it says, and Pharaoh called Abraham and said, what is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife? Why saidst thou she was my sister, so I might have taken her to my wife? And now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. In other words, why did you lie? And he rebuked Abraham here. But again, he sent him away. He sent Sarah away. And he gave him all that he had. And if you notice here, there's no confession of Abram here. You know, and he's going to do this again. When we confess, we get healed. But Abraham here was just going by, you know, no confession. He just took the wife, took his property that the king gave him, and here he left. But you see right here in verse 20, it says, and Abraham commanded his men concerning him, and Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and there sent him away, and his wife, and all that he had. And Abraham took the riches of Egypt. But What I mentioned before, packages, the trouble came later because Hagar was part of the packages that he got from Egypt. Abraham took all the packages, all the goodies out that the king gave him, king of Egypt gave him, and Hagar was going to be one of them that Abram brought from Egypt. And we'll continue in verse 13 later on. But until then, precious saints, God bless.